Hello, I'm Alister McGrath and I'm a theologian at Oxford University, and I want to talk about how to get the most out of my book, The Christian Theology Reader, which is now in its 5th edition. And although many people use my textbook Christian Theology and Introduction, it's always been clear to me that one of the best ways of deepening your grasp of Christian theology is actually to read theologians, to actually engage with texts. And that's why I put together a collection of over 350 readings, which will allow you to read and reflect on the ideas of a wide range of theologians. And in this book, I help you. I introduce each reading carefully, I comment on the reading, and I also provide you with some study questions to allow you to check how much you've actually understood. Now that's good and it's worked out well, but many of you have written to me and told me how helpful you find this work, while at the same time also saying you would like some more help. You've suggested, for example, it'd be good to have a worked example of how to engage one of the texts in this collection of readings. Now I have to say that makes a lot of sense to me, so that's what we're going to do in this presentation. What I'm going to do is look at a single reading and work through it with you in detail. Then you can apply this to other readings. The one we're going to focus on is chapter 1, reading 4, Augustine on Philosophy and Theology. What I'm going to do is to work through this with you in detail, telling you about Augustine, setting the context for the passage, identifying the questions that Augustine is asking, and exploring how we can use his approach in our own thinking. So let's begin by asking, who was Augustine of Hippo? Well, Augustine was a bishop of the Roman colonial town of Hippo Regius, which is now the coastal city of Annaba in modern-day Algeria. And this port was near Carthage, one of the great cities of Roman North Africa, where Cyprian served as bishop in the 3rd century. Now, as I'm sure you know, Augustine is widely regarded as one of the most significant Christian theologians of all time. He was a native of Numidia in North Africa, but he spent some of his career in the major Italian cultural and intellectual centres of Rome and Milan. And that was important to him because that was where he discovered the Christian faith. On his return to Numidia, he was ordained to the priesthood at Hippo in 391 and became its bishop in 395. Now, by this time, the Roman Empire was beginning to show signs of political and economic vulnerability. And Augustine stands at this interface of an old order and an unknown new order. So he's very interesting in terms of this whole change of paradigm that we see around this time. Augustine wrote many works, and perhaps the best known of these are his Confessions and the City of God. But the text we're going to explore in this presentation comes from a work with a Latin title, De Doctrina Christiana, which is often translated as On Christian Doctrine, which I think probably is better translated as How to Teach Christianity. And Augustine began work on this treatise in 397. Now, the text that's incorporated into this reading comes from the second of its 4 major sections, and it deals with the question of whether, and to what extent, Christian writers and preachers can make use of secular philosophers. So to understand the importance of this reading, we need to appreciate the history of this question. So let me explain. This is setting context. One of the most important debates in the early church concerned the extent to which Christians could appropriate the immense cultural legacy of the classical world, for example, poetry, philosophy, and literature. Should Christianity turn its back on the classical Greek and Roman heritage, or should it appropriate this, even if only in a modified form? And this is the context against which this reading needs to be set, a debate about how you appropriate the cultural legacy of the past. Now, early Christian writers gave considerable thought to the way they could make use of secular approaches to, for example, rhetoric, literature, and poetry in developing and communicating their faith. And initially, there was a lot of hostility towards the use of such approaches within the Christian churches. Now, I think you can understand why, because Christianity had an ambiguous legal status within the Roman Empire. On the one hand, it wasn't legally recognized, so it didn't enjoy any particular rights. On the other, it wasn't actually forbidden. However, its growing numerical strength led to it being seen as a threat to political stability, and this led to periodic attempts to suppress it by force. And sometimes these persecutions were local, restricted to regions like North Africa, and sometimes they were sanctioned throughout the Roman Empire as a whole. But you can see the point. Many Christians felt the Roman establishment was trying to wipe out Christianity. For example, Tertullian, a 3rd century theologian based at the North African city of Carthage, argued that Christian theology should avoid contamination. After all, if the Roman Empire was out to destroy Christianity, why collude with its ideas? In fact, allowing Christian theology to be contaminated by secular influences could only lead to heresy. What, Tertullian asked, has Athens to do with Jerusalem? And by Athens he meant classical Greek philosophy. By Jerusalem, of course, he meant the great events that undergirded the Christian faith. And Tertullian was convinced that the Platonic Academy was the source of ideas that would end up corrupting the church. So for Tertullian, Christianity had to maintain its distinct identity, and it did this by disengaging from any form of dialogue with secular culture. There was just no place for secular Roman philosophy in theology. And indeed, Tertullian seems to have thought of Christianity as basically a countercultural movement, which in effect would not allow itself to be contaminated in any way by its intellectual and cultural environment. But there were some difficulties with that consistently negative approach to secular culture. For a start, it seemed to deny Christians access to or use of the rich intellectual and cultural heritage of the Roman Empire to help them preach the gospel. It also prevented theology from engaging in debates within secular philosophy. And furthermore, many early Christian writers realized that classic rhetoric was a very useful tool in helping them to improve their preaching and their writing. In other words, it helped them to communicate their faith to those who were outside the church. And Tertullian just seemed to many to close down some very important possibilities. What, some wondered, was wrong in learning, for example, from Aristotle about the basics of rhetoric and using this in the proclamation of the gospel. Now, the perception that classical culture was intrinsically hostile towards Christianity wasn't unreasonable, as I've stressed. It was reinforced by outbreaks of persecution, such as that begun in February 303 under the Emperor Diocletian, who issued an edict ordering the destruction of all Christian places of worship and the surrender and destruction of all Christian books, and also the cessation of all acts of Christian worship. So you can see why a lot of Christians felt negatively towards classical Roman culture. In many ways, they saw it as a culture of an oppressor that wanted to eliminate them. So they weren't really very enthusiastic about taking this seriously or using it in their evangelistic outreach. However, in 311, things changed. The Emperor Galerius ordered the persecution to cease because it had been a failure. It simply hardened Christians in their resolve to resist the reimposition of classical Roman pagan religion. And Galerius issued an edict of toleration, which allowed Christians to live normally again and to hold their religious assemblies, providing, of course, they didn't disturb public order. And this edict now explicitly identified Christianity as a religion, offering it the full protection of the law. As a result, the church no longer existed under a siege mentality. Now, Christianity had become a legal religion within the empire, but it was simply one among many such religions. It didn't have any particular status. However, at least Christianity ceased to be persecuted, and Christianity was no longer obliged to behave as some kind of underground movement, holding its meetings in secret and concentrating simply on surviving. It meant that Christian theologians could now work without the threat of persecution, and they were able to address a series of major issues relating to consolidation of the emerging theological consensus within the Christian churches. But the conversion of the Emperor Constantine in 313 changed things still further. It led to a major shift in the status of Christianity throughout the Roman Empire, in which it gradually displaced traditional Roman religion and became the state religion. And obviously this changed Christian ways of thinking about secular Roman culture. If the Roman state could be viewed positively by Christians, why not also its cultural heritage? It seemed that a door had opened upon some very interesting possibilities. Theologians could rethink how they could use classic Roman literature and philosophy in both the presentation and defense of the Christian faith. So by the middle of the 4th century, there is a changing attitude. And Augustine played a major role in consolidating this. Augustine set out what is now seen as a definitive Christian response, which I would describe as the critical appropriation of classical culture. For Augustine, an analogy to this process lay to hand in Israel fleeing from captivity in Egypt at the time of the Exodus, a scene here depicted by the Scottish artist David Roberts in 1828. Although Israel left behind the idols of Egypt, the Israelites took gold and silver from Egypt with them and would use these for better purposes in their new way of existence. They'd be used to make the furniture of the tabernacle, its gold cups and its candlesticks, and even the Ark of the Covenant itself. In short, they were repurposed. In much the same way, Augustine argues, the philosophy and culture of the ancient world could be appropriated selectively by Christians, where this seemed right, and thus allowed to serve the cause of the Christian faith. Now, I think this helps us understand why Augustine regularly engages secular writings like Virgil's Aeneid, Plato's Republic, and Cicero's Hortensius, seeing this as a way of connecting the Christian faith with secular culture. It acted like a line of communication to help Romans understand and appreciate the nature of the Christian faith. So this is the position that is set out in this reading to which we now turn. So I suggest you find this reading in a textbook. It's on pages 9 and 10 of the 5th edition of the Christian Theology Reader. And of course, you can pause this presentation at any point while you think things through. So what we're going to do is to work through the text, and I'm going to comment on it as we go along. And do feel free to pause this video from time to time as you think about the issues that we'll be exploring together. Now, the first thing to note is that this reading is set out in 4 main sections. First of all, there's an introduction to the reading, and then there's the reading itself, followed by a brief commentary on the reading, and finally some study questions. And you might like to begin by reading the introduction provided in the textbook, although I think what I'm presenting here is much more helpful than that rather brief account you'll find in the textbook itself. So let's look at the reading itself, and we begin by looking at the opening sentence. If those who are called philosophers, particularly the Platonists, have said anything which is true and consistent with our faith, we must not reject it, but claim it for our own use, in the knowledge that they possess it unlawfully. So Augustine here argues against a total and uncritical rejection of secular wisdom within the church. That was Tertullian's position. For Augustine, if pagan philosophers say something that's true, then Christians are free to make use of it. God is the source of all truth, and Christians are therefore free to use that truth, whatever its source may be. And that brings Augustine to the analogy of the Exodus from Egypt. And he wants his readers to understand the approach he commends by drawing on the Old Testament narrative of the Exodus. This tells, of course, of how the people of Israel left Egypt and began their long journey to the Promised Land. And I'm sure you know that story very well. And early Christian theologians often reflected on the way in which Israel's deliverance from captivity in Egypt somehow seemed to parallel the gospel accounts of human deliverance from sin through the death and resurrection of Christ. Now, Augustine does explore that theme in his writings. It's a very major theme in his thinking about salvation. But that's not the point he's making here. Let's look at Augustine's next sentence. The Egyptians possessed idols and heavy burdens, which the children of Israel hated and from which they fled. However, they also possessed vessels of gold and silver and clothes, which our forebears in leaving Egypt took for themselves in secret, intending to use them in a better way. In a better way. That's the point here. Augustine is arguing that Egypt, who were the oppressors of Israel, imposed burdens on Israel, yet also gave them gold, silver, and clothing. Now, the biblical passage that Augustine has in mind here is Exodus chapter 12, verses 35 and 36, which I'm going to read to you. Just listen to this and set it against the reading. The Israelites did as Moses instructed and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. The Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed towards the people, and they gave them what they asked for, so they plundered the Egyptians. Now, the ideas that Augustine develops here are not actually new. For example, we can find them in a slightly undeveloped form in the 2nd century writer Irenaeus of Lyon, and in a more vigorous version in the 4th century theologian Gregory of Nyssa. But the point is, Augustine develops this idea more systematically, with a clear cultural agenda in mind. Now, the first point being made here is that when the people of Israel departed from Egypt, they left behind them physical and spiritual oppression, and they took with them gold, silver, and clothes. In other words, they were selective. They took what they believed to be good and useful, and they left behind what was bad and burdensome. So Augustine's making the point that pagan philosophy can be used selectively. There is no suggestion it needs to be used in its totality. Some bits are burdensome, but some bits are useful. The second point concerns what Israel did with this gold, silver, and clothes that they took from Egypt. At a later point in the book of Exodus, we learn that the gold and silver of Egyptians were used as the materials to create the holy objects of the tabernacle, such as its gold cups and candlesticks, and even the Ark of the Covenant itself. And the point Augustine will make is that just as pagan riches can be repurposed in the service of God, so the church can selectively appropriate elements from its cultural environment. It can take those cultural riches, melt them down, refine them, and use them in the service of God. Pagan philosophy can be redirected and repurposed for Christian apologetic purposes. So those are the general points that Augustine wants to make. So let's return to the passage and look at Augustine's specific application of this general principle of selective cultural appropriation to the field of philosophy. Let me read the relevant sentences to you. Pagan learning, Augustine declares, and I quote, contains also some excellent teachings, well suited to be used by truth, and excellent moral values. Indeed, some truths are even found among them which relate to the worship of the one God. Now these are, so to speak, their gold and their silver, which they did not invent themselves, but which they dug out of the mines of the providence of God, which are scattered throughout the world, yet which are improperly and unlawfully prostituted to the worship of demons. So that's the passage. Augustine's point is that all truth originates from God, yet it can be distorted or improperly used by those who do not acknowledge its divine origins. What Christians can do, according to Augustine, is to detach such truths from the pagan associations and to put them to Christian use. Now, the point that Augustine is emphasizing here is that in doing so, Christian theologians are not hijacking or stealing pagan truths, but reclaiming God's truth from its improper or inappropriate use. And that's what Augustine is getting at in this programmatic statement in the reading. The Christian, therefore, can separate these truths from their unfortunate associations, take them away, that's the associations, and put them to their proper use for the proclamation of the gospel. So Augustine here makes it clear that the approach he's using is not something that he has invented. It's something that Christians have already practiced. And in the passage he references Cyprian of Carthage, Lactantius, Marius Victorinus, Optatus, and Hilary of Poitiers. And in each case he makes the same point. Look at what these writers brought with them from their pagan backgrounds and the good use to which they were able to put it after their conversion to Christianity. Augustine doesn't actually develop this point in this passage, but let's look at one of the writers he mentions, and that's Cyprian, the martyr bishop of Carthage. Before his conversion to Christianity at about the age of 35, Cyprian was a lawyer and an orator. And after his conversion, those rhetorical and argumentative skills, though gained from pagan sources, were deployed in his ministry as a bishop. Now, Augustine's approach has found wide acceptance within Christian theology. So in closing, we might reflect on what opportunities and risks Augustine's approach brings. One obvious strength is that it facilitates conversation between Christian theology and a wider culture. This, of course, would not be seen as a strength if you take the view that Christianity ought to be intellectually and culturally isolationist. However, many theologians in the period of the early church found it helpful to use Platonic imagery and analogies, such as Christ as a logos, to communicate some core ideas of the gospel to a Platonist audience. And many, I have to say, including myself, find Plato's famous analogy of the dark underground cave in his dialogue The Republic to offer a really interesting framework for wider theological conversations. But there are obviously downsides to this approach. So let's stay with using Platonic ideas to communicate Christianity, which was a major point of discussion in the early church. Here's the point. Does this involve Christianizing Plato or Platonizing Christianity? I think you can see the point. This could be a two-way process. We've got to think about that. Critical appropriation is clearly important. Now, there's lots more we could say about this topic in general and about this reading in particular. But I do hope you found this extended engagement with this reading to be interesting and helpful. And I also hope it will help you to go deeper into other readings now that you have a sense of how you can go about this. As I said earlier, there are more than 300 other readings for you to explore in the Christian Theology Reader, and I hope that you will enjoy these. They're each carefully introduced, and I think you'll find them accessible and engaging. So thank you so much for listening, and goodbye from Oxford.